I lived 5 years in Ethiopia, and the current Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Abiy Ahmed, published a very interesting article a few weeks ago where he was saying only a global victory can end this pandemic. And he was referring about the future assistance that many African countries would need if we want to beat COVID-19 at global levels, right? But someone might say, well, but why Africa if we see that the numbers are relatively low, right? That countries with a high number of cases are maybe South Africa, Morocco, or Egypt are around 5,000 cases. So why as well the General Director of the World Health Organization, Tedros Ghebreyesus, is highlighting the importance of supporting and investing in Africa. So I'm going to explain in my presentation why there is a high risk on the healthcare, on a potential healthcare impact, and the current already impact that the pandemic is having on poverty and on food malnutrition, and what are the drivers for those impacts. So in terms of healthcare impact, I mean, even though the numbers are not very high, we need to as well to consider that there is a limited availability of tests and the capacity to count, right? But if the pandemic would increase, I mean, I was reading different newspapers from different African countries, and for example, in Sudan, having a population of 44 million, in the newspaper were saying that there was no more than 80 ventilators, right? Consider that New York, for example, with 10 million inhabitants, when the crisis started, they had 3,500 ventilators. So almost like 50 times more. So the same thing you could argue with care beds, with health material, because of the impossibility to import, the prices have increased. The lack of protective equipment for health workers, the number of kids, the number of doctors. Just for example, in Spain, we have 20 times more doctors than many low-income countries. And even though, look how we are, right? So the impact on the healthcare system can be huge in the near future. So then, why this is translated in an economic impact? So basically, I mean, the longer the confinement will take in order to protect the lives and the healthcare system of many countries, for example, or many low-income countries, the higher will be the economic impact. And when we are talking about the consequences of this socioeconomic impact, what we are talking about. So I mean, in terms of poverty, the World Bank just published some projections recently, and they were suggesting that already the COVID-19 is pushing between 40 and 60 million people into extreme poverty. So that would, half of those numbers would be in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in South Asia, because countries that will be more affected would be India, Nigeria, or Congo, for example, right? And this is only considering extreme poverty that is based on $1.9 per day. If you consider other poverty lines, like from low, medium income countries or medium income countries that are in 3.2 or $5.5 per day, the numbers are increased to 100 million people that will be pushed to poverty. And the same thing when we talk about food insecurity. World Food Programme and other organizations that work on food insecurity added that 130 million will be pushed into acute risk of food insecurity. So what are the drivers? So, I mean, if we consider the macroeconomics drivers, I mean, as well, we could say that even though the IMF have projected to contract by 3% the economy in 2020, and when you analyze and differentiate high advanced economies and low-income economies, in advanced economies, they project 6% of decrease, and in low or in developing economies, only 1%, and you would say, so why suddenly there is so much impact in poverty? So one of the factors is remittances. Remittances are very important for many low-income countries, and even, for example, since 2019, remittances flows to low and middle-income countries became larger than foreign direct investment, for example. It's super important, and remittances are going to decline at least by 20%. Why? Because many, for example, migrant workers in the US and in other countries will lose their jobs, and they will fall in the wages and in their employments. So they are more vulnerable to decrease their income, and therefore to send remittances. And interestingly, remittances have been usually counter-cyclical. That means that, for example, if there is a drought or a hunger crisis in the Horn of Africa, right? Then families, imagine Somali Somali diaspora that are in other countries, they are helping much more. But in this case, it's the opposite. They cannot, even though there might be a crisis there, because they are following their income, they cannot help. So this is something unique, this fall in remittances that didn't happen in previous crises. And then we have the microeconomic impact, right? So as we know, many people, low-income workers, have more chances to lose their jobs. There is high levels of informality, and high levels of informality, for example, in South America, in average is 55%, in Sub-Saharan Africa is 65%. That means that there is a lack of safety nets and lack of insurance. And as well, these people are harder to reach and support because are not including, right, in the formal figures and numbers. The second is, I mean, many individuals in these low-income markets and low-income economies are having small and medium-sized firms, right? Those what are going to have a lack of access of capital and liquidity problems like we are experiencing now in Spain and many other countries. I'm from Spain. Then, and imagine in urban areas, I mean, I was referring about the huge urbanization of many capital cities in Africa, where they live in congested settlements, right, with low quality services. So that's going to have an impact as well. Then, I mean, there are services like health and education that depend a lot on the public services and on the institutions as well. So if there is a limited access, even by movement, by economical and financial opportunities to those public services and those health and education, right, is gonna impact. Imagine in education where there is no enough digitalization, there is no enough connectivity to have online or virtual education as we are having in other advanced economies. So, well, the impact on the investment of human capital and considering the young population of Africa is gonna have a huge impact as well. Well, the lack of insurances and for people who are kind of in that kind of poverty trap might push them to have coping strategies where they need to sell productive assets, or they cannot invest in human capital in the education of their children, for example. And finally, the disruption in the food supply and markets, right? So probably as well, there will be potential shortage, hikes in the food prices, etc. So all these macroeconomic and microeconomic are going to have a terrible impact. So so far, when the lockdown will be reduced, and it's already affecting based on the data of the World Bank and the UN World Food Program. And in terms of food insecurity, and I finish with this, so far, the main drivers of food insecurity were conflict, climate change, and economic crisis, right? And in total, more or less, acute malnutrition was considered that there was around 130 million. So the figure is doubling now. And it's doubling now because of some of the factors that we mentioned before on micro and macro drivers. And well, you need to join us with conflicts that were in Syria and Yemen, with internal displaced people that because of conflicts that were happening in Burkina Faso, in South Sudan, the langosta plague that the Horn of Africa was suffering in the crops, economic crisis but that they were in other areas. So that combination of these economic impacts and the problems that already were impacting food insecurity is what is pushing the numbers of acute food insecure people so high.
How can the developed countries support the developing countries, considering the world is now a global village? The nature of COVID-19 is such that the spread could continue if there is no platform on the world stage to have agreed measures moving forward, such as travel and tourism. May I ask you to provide your perspective on that, Borja?
Thank you very much, Theo. Yeah, I think, I mean, the multilateral cooperation where somehow developed countries have been coordinating official development aid or other mechanisms have been in risk recently, right? We see that institutions like the UN, for example, well, the US is not anymore like leading or supporting, or is renouncing to lead it as it was before. It had a lot of complications to solve the Syrian war. The Paris Agreement for Climate, for example, is hard to convince different countries, and even though it was partially successful, still there is a lot of things to do. We have had a lot of conflicts with trade, right, recently, and with the World Trade Organization. So now we are so far facing a huge opportunity to either to strengthen the multilateral cooperation, or in contrast, to fall down in the crisis that was entering before, right? So multilateralism in this sense it will be quite important. Then I think there are different mechanisms, right? Like, so the UN has already established a UN crisis management group. The World Health Organization has established a strategic preparedness and response fund. Well, I think I would finish in the same way I started, to round the circle, with the sentence of the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Abiy Ahmed. Only a global victory can end this pandemic, right? So I understand that most of the countries have been focused on domestic issues, domestic problems, because I mean, all of us, we are highly affected. But the final victory will only come when all of us, we end the pandemic. So therefore we are forced to strengthen our international and global collaboration. And that might mean redefine the current platforms. I mean, this year UN was celebrating the 75th anniversary, right? So maybe it's also a good moment to see how we can improve all those international mechanisms. There are already many proposals. Not only in terms of platforms, there are problems that we have in common, like the macroeconomic issues that we have been mentioning during the talk. And we should never forget that even though in advanced economies, definitely we have an impact, when we talk about the impact that this crisis is having in low-income countries, we're talking about people who are suffering acute malnutrition, people who are living with a deprivation of resources that they do not allow them even to have basic services, basic income, basic food. So we should never forget that.